and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Really excited to talk to our guest today. Before I introduce him, I want to make sure that you know who the other voices are in this podcast. I'm joined today by my awesome co-host, Abbigail Cabunoc. Abby, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Welcome. And we're also joined by a guest, of course. Brian Muenzenmeyer is joining us today from his home in the Twin Cities, which I believe is somewhere in the middle of America. It's always a bit vague to me, but that's because I'm coastal and therefore elitist. Brian is joining us from his home office. Behind him, there's a ton of really awesome drawings, clearly by kids. Also a banner saying JavaScript, which is a team that I think has a violent reputation, but I'm very excited to see him out repping that. Brian, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you for the warm intro. There's also a embroidered sign that says unit test it or regret it, which my wife made me many, many years ago. And it's a cherished artifact in the office.
Brian is joining us today because he's written a new book called Approachable Open Source. We thought might be a good fit for this podcast. I'm really excited to dive into the book and what it gets to and how it goes. Before that, I want to know a bit more of your background. Now, I know you work at Target, but you're here representing yourself. Your views are not your employers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Tell us a bit how you got into open source and how your wife made you a unit testing thing. Like, how much do you talk about this at home?
We probably talk about it too much. And when we were finishing up the book, I said to her, it'll be nice to not talk about it anymore now that it's done. And now here we are marketing, right? So it's never far from the kitchen table discussion. But a little bit more about me and my open source journey, I guess. I've been in the web development and tech industry in some way, shape, or form for 15 plus years. And I really started, like many other folks do, in consuming software in some way. And I recall using jQuery mobile at an employer to make our little mobile app work the way we wanted to. And one thing led to another, and I found a typo in the documentation. And it was very humble beginnings of like, that should be fixed. I can fix that. Or maybe, can I? Really the makings of some of these theories, I guess, were even working then. And it's kind of fun because one thing leads to another, and you poke around someone's source code. You learn a little bit more about how someone does something, how they deploy it, how they test their code, what their style guide is, their voice and tone, whatever. And over time, it's gotten a little bit more sophisticated with what I'm comfortable doing. But from those, I guess, humble beginnings, I started getting more and more involved in some software that Brad Frost, who wrote Atomic Design, maintained along with Dave Olson, called Pattern Lab. And I was just some punk kid with a Windows machine who didn't know how to run PHP. So I thought it'd be a great idea to fork it and rewrite the whole thing in Node. And that led me down quite the journey to maintaining a larger and larger project, building a community around it, and meeting a lot of people who, eventually started using it for their day job, to feed their family, to pay their mortgage, that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of responsibility. I met some of the folks that I work with at Target through that project. And I also burned out on said project. So it gave me just a heap of interesting lived experiences that have carried forth today into what I like doing now and into the book.
I always feel overwhelming sense of compassion whenever I talk to anyone who's gone through the JavaScript wars, anyone who's had a project in that community and then come out the back end and like burning out and coming out and still liking open source is amazing. So I totally get where you're coming from. Thank you for sharing that background. Tell me how you arrived at the tail end of burnout to decide, I'm going to write a book about this.
Gosh, that's a really great question. Somewhere in my marketing material, I say like, this book's been writing itself in my head for my entire career too. And I think it's probably a combination of many things that I'm maybe being revisionist about. But I don't think that my experience was special or it wasn't much to write home about. I think lots of people dabble in it and kind of get sucked in, and then they start to feel a lot of guilt around, I'm not doing enough. It took a long time for me to understand that that was normal and that there were things that I could do about it to not only protect myself as an individual contributor, or if I have time to do things, but also that this could be a designed outcome, that this safety and this community could be something that maintainers build for with intent. And that's been a big part of it. I think the other thing that's been really eye-opening for me is that as now a more enterprisey corporate engineer over the course of my career, it's been really clear to me that there isn't this dichotomy between consumption and contribution, that there's really this like spectrum of activities that we can engage in. And it's those corporate engineers, it's those latent energy type folks who are consuming, like I said, it was with regard to like jQuery mobile way back then. Like those are the people who have the capacity and I believe the agency to do something, to contribute upstream. It's in everyone's best interest to do so. So as I started to piece together that there was a place for me, that there were people that had like-minded interests within whatever tech it happened to be at the time, that there was avenues for me to help out, even if it wasn't doing all the coding unnecessarily. There's just a huge, huge opportunity across a lot of territory.
So, Brian, I'm a huge fan of your book. As you know, I had the privilege of reading it pretty early on. Everyone should get a copy of this. I think I say this is the book maintainers have been waiting for. And knowing a bit more about your story and just coming out of burnout, but still flying this JavaScript flag behind you, it really highlights how your experiences have shaped this book. And you can really see your empathy inside this book as it's been written. How are you hoping to shape how open source will be happening in the future with your book? Do you hope to have a more balanced way to do open source?
Yeah, it's a great question. Before I get too far into forgetting, the JavaScript pennant that I'm flying proudly is given to me by my good friend Colin Dean, who's active in the homebrew community in the Pittsburgh tech scene. So I want to thank him for giving me that. It's pretty sweet. But your question about how I want to shape the narrative further, right? Like that feels at times incredibly humbling. How can one person do that? I'd almost reject it on face value, but I think it's actually a really fair question because there's a whole theory or through line in the book that I kind of piggybacked off of Jeremy Keith in one of his talks on about shifting our perspective between what we think is possible and what we could do as individuals. The web, open source in general, is a single lifetime old, and that we are incredibly privileged to be here at its inception. And there are so few of us working in this field that you can point to examples of individual efforts moving the needle, making a dent in the grain and changing outcomes. So our percent impact is very great. You can't say that about many fields today. So we're really uniquely positioned to care about it. And that perspective is something I want to impart on people who, or maybe much like me back in the day, where they're using software all day long, and everyone does in some capacity, and they are well positioned to make it better, to find a project, a patron, to create one themselves. In my mind, most likely probably contribute to something that exists already and make it better. We have the agency to do so. And that really excites me.
I guess a question I have to follow up from that is that I look at the web and I feel kind of sad a lot because I feel like it kind of failed in a lot of different ways. Maintainers shouldn't have to burn out so much. Open source shouldn't be abused so much that it seems like there's a lot of people putting a lot of effort in and not getting a lot back, except for some things like Wikipedia, which are clearly the best things ever. And that's amazing. But I'm curious, in order to make this an actionable question, one of the things I think about a lot when I think about the web and about JavaScript and about code and about open source is a lot of the low-hanging fruit is kind of gone. And now it's kind of the hard job of us cleaning up what other people have messed up and finding niches over and over again in order to sort of fix the edges of the web. What do you think about that perspective? And what do you think about our job going forward, building a better tech world?
If I had to rewrite the book, I would make mention of pace layers. And this is a concept that I guess I've seen socialized a couple different places now. But if you think about orbital bodies surrounding something, the closer they are to it, they might be spinning slower and then farther and farther away in order for them to revolve around that body. They need to be moving faster. So there's layers of pace. We'll have to try and dig up the reference, but like you can even map this to things like civilization itself. And closer to home within the world that we have, you can see this happening all the time with innovation in the tech space. Think about CSS variables, as people call them now, and how those were internalized and made into the actual spec based on a lot of the experimentation that happened in the SAS or the less world. The same could be true about things like Flash turning into Canvas. I see this more noticeably today. Most of my maintaining that I do in the open source world is in the Node.js project. Like I said before, I forked something into Node many years ago, and now I'm helping maintain the Node website. And what's been interesting to see with Node is the innovation that its competitors have pressured or put on it to make that core engine, the one that has the momentum, pull in some of its orbital bodies. So now Node has its own test runner, and you might not need Jest anymore. Node has env support, so you might not need .env. It has its own watch mode, which you might not need Watchman or any other library like that. These are pace layers and ecosystems working kind of in real time. There's innovation that's just like breakneck fast. And then there's solid institutionalized coalescence, gravity around things that work. And I think that concept can be applied to JavaScript frameworks. It can be applied to the web as its core set of technologies and specs. And it can be applied to civilization as well, if we can find the reference. And to answer your question a little bit more close to the spirit of what you asked, like, I don't really see it as like failure and like, we're cleaning up after ourselves. I think you can definitely view ads and tracking software and malicious actors in that light, of course. But there's all kinds of amazing things that are happening when you kind of adopt an intentionally optimistic perspective about how much access and connection there now is within the web due to some of the protocols we've created. And there's just a lot there that if we choose to focus on, we can think of as good. I actually love to talk to Abby about that. You've been spearheading a lot of open source practices within the scientific community for a long time now, right? And I feel like that has advanced the state of play within that field immensely.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of the work that we're doing with Mozilla Science has become more institutionalized. I really like how you describe these pace layers, how at the time it felt like we were iterating quickly. We were trying new ideas. Like, is this a best practice? I remember just coming up with things that I thought might be best practices for scientists. Some of them didn't stick, but some of them did. And the ones that did, around like using notebooks, sharing your data, like those things have really stuck and have become best practices and getting a lot of momentum. So I think you're right. These changes are happening in our lifetime. And I'm really excited to see what comes next. And I do think your book will help with this next wave of changes.
Thanks. I don't really pretend to be a thought leader in all of this stuff. It's very bizarre and humbling to like have people come up to me and ask opinions about things. So maybe that's imposter syndrome or something speaking. But I don't know, I feel like that there's a big opportunity to contextualize what we're doing beyond the current story that you might have on the sprint board or the current product you're working on or even the job you have, and to think of all of us as craftspersons in the medium of the web or in the medium of open source. The work that we're doing isn't really for us. If you're making open source software, like kind of by definition, it's not really for you, right? You're sharing it with the world. And maybe I'm just a sucker for that way of thinking and altruism, but it really speaks to me in terms of making something bigger than yourself.
I love the pace layers metaphor too. It's great to hear new metaphors on here. I'm looking at the table of contents for your book. So we have around 7 chapters: principles and promise, the spectrum of engagement, consuming open source software, the 4 files of any open source project, community investment, open source in the workplace, and open source sustainability. Obviously, number 7 is the one that jumped out to me. Can you talk a bit about what's in that chapter?
Yeah, I can. There's a through line with that chapter around we've been moving fast and breaking things with tech for a long, long time. And there's a couple examples in there of how that breaking part really does harm. Of course it does. There's examples of some folks delisting packages from the NPM registry, kind of in protest of feeling exploited and causing cascading failures across ecosystems. And there's a blog post of my own that I revisit within there called I Maintainer. It was very like Isaac Asimov-esque about like trying to coin some laws of open source maintenance. And that was actually really fun to retrospect on in writing the book, because the laws, as I described them at first, were written when I was right in the midst of burnout with Pattern Lab. And I was trying to reaffirm or self-affirm that I was doing the right thing and that I would do right by the community, even at my own peril. Putting something out there was a contract that I could not break. I had a responsibility. And like that's the genesis of a lot of open source guilt. But when I revisited that content post burnout and in writing that, I realized that I had it exactly wrong. The whole point of trying to work within the open source ecosystem is to avoid burnout, is to work well together, is to protect yourself against all other things. And like my father will always say that I need to take care of myself before I can take care of my family, before I can take care of anything else. And like, it's fatherly wisdom. He has to say it. And I don't know how well anyone ever listens, but that's covered in the book for a good length. I do also cover some interesting experiments that are emerging with funding. If we're talking about contribution and like a spectrum of engagement, directly funding is something that I think there's a lot of really interesting work going on even right now. Abby, you've been talking about this when we were drafting this book a year or so ago on how we still haven't really cracked how to do this sustainably. But I'm really excited to see things like the Sovereign Tech Agency create some work there. The ecosystems work that passed my feed like yesterday. And some really, really cool work around algorithmic dependency, data-driven contribution. That kind of stuff is quite interesting, I think, because the more avenues we can create for corporate contribution to be like easy mode, I think the better off we are. So there's a lot of that that's in that chapter. Abby is also interviewed in that chapter and it helps me make a lot of these points too. I'd love to hear if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you covered it well. The things that you brought up and that you started talking about in the book, still happening today, still haven't cracked it. And there's just still so much innovation going on. So thinking back to your pace layers, it's interesting to see what's going to stick and what's going to become integral with open source.
Yeah, one thing that I noticed, and I think it's okay for us to be experimenting. That's the whole point. And software engineers they're kind of hardwired to like think about iteration. So that's healthy. I was actually looking at that ecosystems work, and I think the Microsoft blog post about it, and some of the projects that got funded algorithmically by that process are like the heavyweights in the ecosystem, like Jest, Babel, React. And it's kind of interesting because like, if you look at Jest's Open Collective, they're sitting on a war chest that they haven't really spent. So it feels like we're compounding donation to and I don't mean to single them out, but there's other examples too. There's projects that seem to be controlled by corporation. How are those getting through the algorithm? That was my spicy take on looking at that I wasn't courageous enough to comment on, but here we are. And I think that's okay because we'll learn if that works. We will learn if there needs to be a human in the loop. We'll learn if we will augment that strategy with the more traditional nominations-based funding model that some people do. And the answer might be all of the above, right? We diversify our approach. We make something that is the best of all of them.
I'm looking at the title of chapter 4, the 4 files of any open source project. And to me, that sounds like README, contribute, license, maybe something else. I'm not sure what the 4th one is. But couching that in the conversation we just had, a lot of times what leads to burnout is trying to figure out how to navigate this space. How do you navigate dealing with issue management, dealing with PRs, dealing with new feature requests, dealing with the competition of other open source projects, and also dealing with, okay, I need to get funded with Patreon. I need to get funded with GitHub. I need to get funded with Open Collective. I need to get funded by actually applying to actual funds. And then, I'm getting some money from this other thing. So I need to sign up for thanks.dev, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just a lot. And it's a lot when a lot of open source work is done in the evenings or done as part of your job, but you also have like you need to ship products or something if you're a normal software developer. So I'm curious, as someone who's gone through burnout and written a book about it, do you have any tips or advice for maintainers to deal with the onslaught of information and the nimbleness that you need to be a maintainer among this sort of still fastly moving space?
Yeah, I do. A couple things come to mind. I think I'll start with drawing the owl. If you understand that meme, I think if you look at a mature open source project and try to emulate it at the outset, you're going to be disappointed and you're going to feel like you're always behind. I think it's important to remember that none of those projects ever started in their fully materialized form. They started with pretty humble ambitions and maybe a community of one. I know I said before that any open source work is really giving to the community, but being self-sufficient or being oriented, towards your own use cases, of course, makes sense at the outset. As the complexity grows and as your demographics or your community grows, I think it's natural that people are going to want more of you. They're going to want translations of your documentation. They're going to want this extra flag that does one thing different than what you had envisioned. And you're right, it can really become overwhelming. So there's some discrete advice in here around notification management and being able to walk away from things when you want to. You should go touch grass and have a life, and try not to think about your project in the shower. Sometimes thinking happens there, of course, but there needs to be an outlet that isn't always this. And there's a whole lot of content and concrete advice around just the management of it. But contingent with that is, with increasing interest should also be increasing avenues for contribution. I use this analogy of the community garden throughout chapter 2, I believe, where no one person can really make a community garden function, right? You need to secure a site for it. You need to procure the building material. You need to map out the plots of the work so people can know where they're going to plant. You need to know what you're going to do with the yield. Maybe you donate it somewhere. Over time, people develop some specialization, or maybe someone comes in and helps with just the fencing, and they might not even touch dirt. They might not even do any gardening, and that's okay. Successful community garden will create those opportunities for a diverse set of folks. The other thing I wanted to really hammer home and touch upon that you said before is, well, a lot of this happens on nights and weekends. I have definitely been in that camp. I've taken selfies of holding on to my newborn while trying to program before, right? And I thought it was cute at the time, and maybe it was. But now I circulate a slide whenever I'm giving a presentation that just in big, bold letters says, you don't need permission to do your job. And I really try to live by that and model that behavior for the engineers around me too, because like I said before, everyone's consuming software all day long. There's nothing that really says you can't be contributing back to it as just part and parcel of your role, whatever that role might be. If you're a developer, if you're a designer, if you're a technical writer, if you're in product, in accessibility, really anything. In my opinion, and in the opinion of my allies and leadership and all that, you're already empowered to fix the things that you see broken. If it's an extremely large lift or a really huge enhancement, maybe you need to secure a little bit of your time or ask for permission, but you can do this in small ways too. Run an experiment. Instead of buying a maintainer a coffee, spend a coffee cup's amount of time looking at their issue log and seeing if you can +1 or corroborate an issue, or you can test a PR, you can fix something that's low hanging, whatever you want to do. I can guarantee that you will find some work to do within some of those projects. And the projects that are orienting and designing for those moments are the ones that are going to be most successful. And that's what the book also teaches.
I love that so much. I don't know if we've had that sentiment on this before. Instead of buying a coffee, just look at their issue log for a coffee amount of time. That's a really, really great framework. It's really clear to me that you know what you're talking about. It's going to be that this book is going to be helpful for people out there who are sort of just getting into open source or who've been around for a while and are open source people who just want another perspective from someone who has 1,000 yard stare of someone who's seen some things. So I love that. And I think that's great. You mentioned something earlier, which I kind of want to come back to, which is diversity of roles. And I'm curious about your thoughts on diversity of the ecosystem. Open source has historically been a white, male-educated, dominated world. And that is increasingly less the case. And it matters because things like paying maintainers, it's totally different if you're paying them if they live in Lagos, Nigeria, as opposed to if they live in San Francisco and have 4 kids or something. And I'm just curious about your thoughts about the future of open source from that perspective. How can we get more languages involved, more underrepresented groups? And what do you think is going to change?
I'll be the first to admit that I don't know how to crack this, how to solve for it. I think that making contributions as accessible and as bite-sized and as approachable in the name helps everyone be able to find the time to work on this. Last month, I was at the Node.js Collaborator Summit in Dublin, Ireland, and there were 2 women amongst 50 men or something like that. It's obvious and palpable and embarrassing and frustrating all at the same time. So I don't have sage advice as to how to solve for this, but I do know that encouragement and, like I said, creating those opportunities and reinforcing them with a whole lot of individual care and public celebration when it does happen is great. I work with someone who recently patched a vulnerable version of Axios, and they're in a couple underrepresented fields, demographics, and they patched this vulnerability for 9 million people or 9 million projects, and it's like, that is time well spent that I've tried to trumpet as much as possible. We have some maintainers on the Node.js site that are 17 and 18 years old. What an amazing opportunity to be exposed to a wealth of knowledge in the rest of the community and things like that. Worldwide projects are quite interesting because they're a melting pot of opinions. I certainly haven't gotten it right all the time. On the Node project, we had some pride representation that caused an extreme amount of hate and intolerance to come our way. And while that's obviously not okay, it's interesting to think about some parts of the world where that intolerance is just a part of the systems within which they work and in which they live. And it continuously humbles me and challenges me to be better and to think about all aspects of it while also being an ally and trying to thread the needle. But I'm sure you've heard of the paradox of tolerance. It's a lot of heavy stuff. I don't have the answers to directly as one person. The book also tries not to shy away from this topic. And that was one thing that was kind of interesting about the process that this book was made, is that my publisher at the time was a little reluctant to wade into these waters, and they're no longer in the picture. And I tried to go a little deeper into this and find a well-rounded human perspective of what makes sense. And my position is vulnerable, evolving, and trying to continuously learn as an ally here.
Thanks. It's a really tough question, but I think that's also a beautiful answer. Do what you can and help trumpet other people's successes. Brian, this sounds like an awesome book. I'm really excited to read it. Where can I get it?
It's available through approachableopensource.com. I am fulfilling all the orders myself on camera right now. Here's one right here. And if you don't want a physical copy, which I can currently only ship to the US and Canada, you can also get a digital copy anywhere in the world, also through the same website, approachableopensource.com.
No, we're not recording the video, but I do want to share. I have my copy right here. Thank you for shipping. Thank you for extending shipping to Canada, although I did ship this to the US.
It's an unfortunate reality of how expensive things happen to be, right? And I've had a lot of people in Europe ask about it too, and it's just really prohibitively expensive. So looking into options for print on demand in Europe and Australia, I think there's even some in the Middle East that in Asia that are possible, but continuing to explore all of those great avenues to get it in people's hands.
Go to approachableopensource.com to get that book. Brian, thank you so much for being on this podcast. Don't leave yet. At the end of every episode, we have a bit called Spotlight, where we highlight other people, projects, or things. After Spotlight, we also have the long addendum where I sound like a medicine ad where I just talk really fast, saying all the things you should do. So hang around for that too. All right, spotlight. I'll go first. My spotlight today is going to be Stephen Colbert, for no other reason than that he gives me immense amounts of joy, just like consistently throughout my life. Seeing that Brian came from the small town of Manitowoc, I could not but feel joy remembering when Stephen Colbert put a giant photo of the Putekateke great crested grebe just randomly on the side of a building in Manitowoc for the New Zealand Bird of the Year competition. That was my favorite thing ever. We need more people like Stephen Colbert in the world. Tears are coming to my eyes just remembering how joyful that made me. Abby, what's your spotlight today?
My spotlight, going with the book theme, and I thought of the spotlight before I realized it was Connection, but it's Calibre. I've used it for years. It's ebook management software. It's open source. I've used it for years.
Cool. Thank you, Abby. Ryan, what's your spotlight today?
I think I'm going to make a personal shout out to my good friend, Jeffrey Purcell. He was at one point my co-maintainer of Pattern Lab way back when, and he started using the project at Target and got me visiting headquarters. And I often tell him that through the butterfly effect of the universe, I live in Minnesota and I have 2 Minnesotan kids who are Vikings fans, not Packer fans, all because he randomly found my open source project and thought it would be cool to reach out to me. So it's really funny how life works that way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Listeners, if you've enjoyed this podcast, there's a few things you can do. First, you can like it wherever you have listened to it. Just press the like button or heart or whatever it is. Plus, I don't know, skull, whatever. Second, you could talk about it with all your friends and your enemies. Just people you don't know on the street. Just tell them how great the Sustain podcast is. And tell them they should donate by going to opencollective.com/sustainoss and donate to the podcast. You also should donate all of your money, all of it. A rich man has no chance of getting into heaven, says Jesus. So just straight out forlorning that from old 2,000-year-old text, you should definitely donate to this podcast. Besides that, you could also send us hate mail at richard@sustainoss.org or podcast@sustainoss.org. In particular, you could talk about how I shouldn't use 2,000-year-old text to talk about people donating to this podcast. That would be really nice. Or you could suggest other things to do. This is the most off-piste example of how to give this end text I've ever done. But I'm kind of liking it, and I hope you like it too, listeners. So please send us your thoughts. That would be really great. And really, go to approachableopensource.com. Buy the book. If you live abroad, email Brian and then ask him to send you the ebook or ask him to send you an entire box of books so you can then send it on to other people. You could do that too. Brian, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. Good luck with everything. It seems like you have a good head on your shoulders, so I'm not even sure that you need the good luck. It just seems like you just do the work, which is excellent. So keep it up. But thank you.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate the time.